Now, the text we're going to be tackling today over the next around 20 minutes is one of the most famous texts of all time, one of the most influential plays, and perhaps the best play of all time by some critics. And that is, of course, William Shakespeare's gargantuan play, Hamlet. Now, Hamlet is one of William Shakespeare's most well-regarded plays, and for good reason. It's written in a kind of late period in his life, before the very, very late period of tragic comedies, when he was writing quite serious and quite dark tragedies. Now, if you've been following some of my other Shakespeare classes, or if you have some familiarity with Shakespeare, you know that we can kind of categorize Shakespeare's career into three main arcs. The first arc is that of the comedies and the light-hearted entertainment. The second arc is Shakespeare moving into tragedies, and the third arc is that of tragic comedies, such as, plays like The Tempest. Hamlet is very, very much grounded in tragedy. It is not a funny play at all. There are some comedic relief characters and moments, but by far, it is one of Shakespeare's darkest plays. Now, some other things that Shakespeare wrote around this time are plays like Macbeth, which I'm sure lots of you have heard of before, for its bloody and brutal murder. We know that Shakespeare also wrote things like Othello and King Lear, which are very, very intense plays that deconstruct a person's identity or deconstruct things about societal role. But out of all of these plays, perhaps Hamlet is the most unique and the most focused on one particular idea that was probably plaguing Shakespeare's mind all throughout that period of life. Now, what is unique about the play Hamlet when compared to a lot of other Shakespeare plays? One, for a play that has a titular character, which is most of Shakespeare's plays, what I mean by titular character is there's a character's name in the title, like Hamlet or Macbeth. For a play with a titular character, we spend actually an enormous amount of time within Hamlet's head, perhaps more than any other play which has the name of a character in the title. So, for example, we look at, The Merchant of Venice, not really a name, but we know that refers to the character of Shylock. We don't actually spend that much time getting to know Shylock. He does have a couple of good speeches here and there, but we really don't see the play from his perspective. Even when we look at other plays like Macbeth, where, Macbeth does have a lot of soliloquies, we do spend a lot of time with Macbeth, there are lots of other characters in Macbeth that do take up quite a bit of space. For example, Lady Macbeth becomes quite a big part of that play. Hamlet, however, is almost entirely spent with the character of Hamlet. Now, what makes that, or why does that make this particular play significant? When we start looking at the themes that Shakespeare is exploring in this play, we can tell that Hamlet is a very, very concentrated effort to analyze, to understand one particular part of human life. And that is, how do we make our choices? Or do we have free will to make our choices? Or even further still, what influences our choices and what influences the consequences of our choices? If we were to summarize all of these questions under one category, it would be existentialism. It would be questions to do with and questions directly related to the very essence of existence. What gives our life meaning? What gives our decisions motivation and purpose and something to fight for? All of these are questions that are very, very personally explored in the play of Hamlet. Not through Hamlet's interactions with other people, obviously, though that's very, very important as well, but it's explored in a very personal, intimate way. And that is probably not that present in many of Shakespeare's plays. Now, before I get into kind of delving in and unpacking some of the themes of Hamlet, one thing that we have to know about Hamlet's context is the kind of governmental and the reign of the kings and queens, the kind of change that was happening at that time that influenced Shakespeare to write about some of these themes. Now, we have to understand that Shakespeare was around during a time which we might call Elizabethan England, obviously named after Elizabeth. Now, why is this particularly significant? Elizabethan England was a period of time defined by massive change. And not only massive change, massive and constant change. It was a time period where, for example, lots of people who used to be very rich and very noble were losing their money. There were lots of new people gaining a lot of money. Okay, this is kind of in the backdrop of the Renaissance, where there's lots of different people coming up with all sorts of new ideas, new ways of looking at the world, especially when it comes to questioning things like religion and questioning things like the institutions of religion, for example. And it was a time where change was almost happening every other year. And not just small change, like I said before, massive society shifting change. And one of those changes that's perhaps the most obvious and the most impactful is the kind of flip-flopping of religion in England. Now, obviously, at this time, in the 16th and 17th century, England was a country which was defined by a set religion, okay? So there was a religion that was embedded in the Constitution of England that was kind of the official religion of the state. Now, obviously, in our current Western world, a lot of our countries are secular. And what secular means is religion is separated from the operation of government. But in England, at that time, before the establishment of other, institutions and things like that, it was very much the church and the state were united, okay? And in some forms of English monarchy back then, the person who was the king or the queen was both the head of the state and the head of the church. So, why is that significant? When a state is also the head of a church, the state is essentially the reason or the meaning of someone's existence, right? Why? Because the state not only is, the body that controls a lot of the money, a lot of the day-to-day life, a lot of the practicality of being English or living in that particular place, but as the head of the church, the state is also very much responsible for the spiritual and moral development of its citizens. Now, what was controversial during Elizabethan England was the many, many times that, for example, leadership changed in the monarchy. So, for example, right after Shakespeare's birth, we had King Henry VIII, okay? And there were tensions between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. Over that period of time, after we move on to Edward VI, okay, and then later on, for example, Queen Mary, there was constant back and forth change between Protestant religion and Catholic religion. Now, Catholic religion and Protestant religion, we're not going to get into the specific details of each of them, but obviously under Catholic religion, there are things like popes and there are things like leaders of the church, whereas the Protestant religion is more kind of egalitarian in a sense, although it wasn't necessarily applied in that way. So what we have is England in a kind of constant state of peril. Some years, the church or the state will be Protestant and the king or the queen who's in power will try to destroy all the Catholic emblems and statues. And then a couple of years later, okay, for example, when Queen Elizabeth comes back on, a different king comes back on, the church might flip over as well. Now, it was very, very complicated during this time. There were lots of tensions between the two religions, and there were lots of people who were quite disillusioned with the constant oscillation between religions of the state. Not only was it very difficult to exist sometimes, okay, it was very difficult to know, okay, what is legal or what is illegal, what would get me in trouble or in jail. at certain times, it was also a very difficult thing to accept from a fundamental level. Now imagine if you were living in England, okay, and your religion was constantly changing over and over. One day we're meant to believe in this kind of interpretation of the Bible, and the next day we're meant to believe in another completely different interpretation of the Bible, where there is, for example, a pope, and the pope is the head of the church and the person who is so-called closest to God. Very, very difficult time in England. And a lot of people were quite disenchanted by it, and disenchanted by religion in general. Hamlet is about exploring the ramifications of that kind of feeling. The ramifications of change leading to disillusionment. Change leading to questioning. Change leading to an existential awakening. So now that we understand the context of Hamlet, let's dive more into the play itself. Just like Hamlet's context is full of change, Hamlet's actual fictional world is also on the cusp of major change. When the play opens, Hamlet is suffering in a state of both political and social turmoil, as well as personal turmoil. What's happened? Hamlet is the Prince of Denmark, and he's just won a war. Well, at least his father's won a war, but they're in between wars. There's always the threat of invasion, so there's constantly a sense of unease. Second of all, Hamlet's father has suddenly and mysteriously passed away, and not only that, but his mother has married his father's brother, his uncle. So he's undergoing some serious and major shifts in his life that make him feel very uncertain of his own identity and of his own self. And on top of all of this conflict, which normally in other Shakespeare plays would be the entire play, what happens right at the very start of Act 1? Hamlet meets a ghost. And not only is it just any ghost, the ghost says that it's his father. Okay, so apparently Hamlet's father has come back from the grave to talk to him, and Hamlet's father reveals that Hamlet's uncle, Claudius, who is now married to his mother, killed him and was a murderer. This is why Hamlet is Shakespeare's longest play by far. It contains the most words and the most scenes because it has so much to go through in terms of one personal character. All of these conflicts Hamlet has to resolve or has to go through in some way, has to resolve in his own mind what he should do about it. Now, linking this back to the context we talked about just then, Hamlet is in a very unstable situation and very unstable point in his life. He does not know who or what to rely on. He can't really rely on his family anymore because he feels betrayed that his mother, so soon after his father's death, married off to his brother. Almost a ridiculous type of marriage, in his opinion. He can't really rely on things like, the military because they're in between wars. He has no one to rely on, and plus he's just seen a ghost which has revealed something potentially life-changing for him that he feels that he needs to get revenge for. Compounded on top of that, Hamlet doesn't even know if he can really trust the ghost which tells him of the father's murder. How does he know that the ghost is actually his father and not some trick sent out to make him commit murder? He is full of uncertainty and full of doubt, and that is exactly how the people of England must have felt in the Elizabethan period, or at least right at the very start of the Elizabethan period when we had, for example, Queen Mary and King Henry and King Edward. How they must have felt living in that kind of society where the constant shifting of power and the constant shifting of ideology made relying on anything particularly difficult. Now, what is the struggle in Hamlet at the end of the day? What is the thing that Hamlet fights? What is the thing that Hamlet tries to overcome or solve? At the end of the day, in my opinion, Hamlet is a play which is about a person trying to find justification for his actions. It's about someone who needs to do something very, very serious and basically condemnable, the most serious crime. He has to kill Claudius. He has to commit murder. And he has to find some justification to do such a life-shattering thing as to take someone else's life. And most of the play is spent in a situation where Hamlet simply does not know what to do. He can't bring himself to kill Claudius simply based on the word of a ghost, which he doesn't know if it's actually his father's ghost or not. He can't bring himself to kill simply of his own volition, even though he motivates himself and he tries really hard to find out the truth himself. And at one point in the play, even catches Claudius admitting to the murder. He is struggling with the question of agency. He's struggling with the question of free will. Even if I do choose to kill someone, he thinks, is that my own choice? Does it make me less guilty if I do it because my father's ghost told me because I'm getting revenge? These are all questions that go through Hamlet's mind that most of the play is centered on resolving. Now, obviously, there's a bunch of other side characters in Hamlet as well, which I'm not going to go into in lots of detail. But there's lots of personal turmoil that is thrown in Hamlet's direction all throughout the play. Now, not only does Hamlet commit, for example, an accidental murder at one point and kills a close friend of the family, which causes one of his friends and his lovers to commit suicide, one of the most tragic events which happens past the halfway point in the play. But this is a play in which massive societal forces are happening and changing all the time. For example, Fortinbras, which is the son of the country that Hamlet's country, Denmark, recently conquered and overcame. Fortinbras is a character that Hamlet admires, that plans to invade Denmark and take it over. All of that is happening in the background as well. So, what is the progression of Hamlet then? What is the ultimate conclusion we can come to? Or maybe what is Shakespeare trying to say? Now, if we delved into it literally, we could almost say that the conclusion is that we should trust in God. But I think it's a little more complex than that. How the play begins, of course, is Hamlet relying on his father's word to justify his actions, to basically justify murder. He doesn't really have free will at the start because he's just following the instructions of a ghost who has given him instructions. That is how Hamlet starts as a character. He feels very unmasculine. He doesn't feel like he's in control. He doesn't feel like a strong, powerful prince. His personality at the start is very timid and unsure of himself. And he's only motivated to get revenge when he hears his father give him instructions. His father, this war hero who he admires, who he thinks is the greatest man who ever lived, he can only follow those instructions. But after Hamlet begins to doubt the word of the ghost, he tries to take control of his own free will. He tries to take his actions into his own hands by not only trying to discover his own evidence for whether Claudius killed his father, but also trying to make himself motivated to do it, and not make himself motivated just because someone else told him to do it. Now, obviously, at this point, we have one of the most famous speeches of all time, perhaps the most famous speech or soliloquy that's ever been put to paper, the To Be or Not To Be soliloquy. And that really happens at kind of the climax point in the play when Hamlet is really trying to decide, what am I meant to do in this situation? How am I meant to treat my agency and my free will? The whole point of that question, to be or not to be, is essentially Hamlet contemplating the option of suicide. He's contemplating how difficult it is to exist as a human being. He's contemplating how much suffering that he goes through, the difficulty and the struggle of not being able to make a decision, as he says, the arrows of fate. He's struggling against all of this simply by existing. And he says, would it be better to sleep? Would it be better to sleep, obviously meaning, would it be better to just perish, to die, to let go of all of these things? And that is why he asks the question, to be or not to be. Is it harder to live or is it harder to die? Now, at that point in the play is when Hamlet represents the most that he's ever been a free human being. He's someone who has taken his life into his own control, but now struggles to find the actual motivation to carry out the action that's required of him, that of murder. As we get closer and closer to the end of the play, however, Hamlet takes a second turn. So recall, he takes a turn at the start when he's, simply following his father's instructions. He turns into a person who takes things into his own hands. But right at the end of the play, when everything is combining and all the people that Hamlet is dying around him, often of his own fault and due to his own mistaken actions, that is when Hamlet begins to put his trust in God instead. So what is Hamlet's conclusion right at the end of the play when we say the big tragedy moment happens, when essentially most of the cast perishes in this one final fight? Instead of taking his actions into his own hands, Hamlet basically concludes that, well, God has predetermined my fate. God knows what we're gonna do. There's a great soliloquy, great speech that he delivers at the end to his friend who has been by him the entire time, in which he tries to basically say that we can't unravel the strings of providence. And of course, providence means the control that God has over things. Hamlet concludes the end of the play by going into a fight that he knows he will die at. He knows he will lose. He knows people will die. But he goes into it anyway because he thinks that he accepts his fate. So, across the course of this one play, and even though I said it was Shakespeare's longest play, we still have to remember it's only one text, and plays are usually shorter than novels. Across the course of this one play, we see this complex personal evolution in Hamlet, from someone who is deontological, who follows rules, who follows principles. If my father gets killed, I have to revenge my father, to a kind of existential hero, someone who tries to find his own reasons for doing something, someone who's fiercely independent, to someone who is kind of a fighter of God, someone who puts his trust in the divine providence, who puts his trust in fate. Does that mean Shakespeare says we shouldn't take our life into our own hands and we should always trust in God? Does that mean that Shakespeare's trying to say we should never follow other people's principles, we should always find our own, or we should always listen to those of God? No. Even though Hamlet trusts in God at the end, what happens to him? He dies, right? It's not a happy ending. In fact, not only he dies, his entire family basically dies. So it's not a glowing justification of any three of those means of living your life, whether it be following other people's principles, trusting in God, or taking your life into your own hands. He doesn't approve any of them. He doesn't say this is the one you have to go with in order to lead a successful life. Why? Because this string of things leads to almost every character in the play dying. So what is Shakespeare's ultimate message? Shakespeare's ultimate message is not about what rule set to follow, but rather that it is extraordinarily difficult as a human being to find that kind of rule set. It is extraordinarily difficult as a human being to escape that process of tension, to escape that constant conflict in your mind about what should I do? What should I trust in? What gives my actions meaning? Am I actually free? Shakespeare's conclusion is there is no easy explanation. There is no clean justification where we can simply say, oh, yes, my actions are free because of X, Y, Z. There's nothing clean like that. It's very, very complex, and it's a question that haunts people until the day they die. Hamlet is an exploration of disillusionment. It's an exploration of internal struggle. It's an explanation of someone trying to come to terms with themselves and who they are as a person and their own actions. It's first and foremost not a play which has a message. Okay, we should really detach ourselves from the idea that plays or texts have messages, these big moral things that we're meant to take home to be a better person. Shakespeare is much more complex than that. It is simply a portrayal of the extreme struggle and the suffering that each human being goes under day by day, whether you're in Hamlet's position where he's facing these extreme challenges or you're not. It's an exploration of the existential crisis that each of us as people goes through in their lives. Hope that's given you a pretty good idea of what to expect in Hamlet.